I just think that I think that because I just ended at secondhand smoke, kind of really, like I think there's like a cool niche to like being, a part of this very, compact era. Um, so I feel fortunate about that. But what I would say about what I've wanted to say in skateboarding is I think, Waiting for Lightning. I'm obviously made a film on Danny, and I've known Danny since he was a little kid, and I've also known Danny through Mike Ternasky's eyes, which is also a way for me to know myself through Mike Ternasky's eyes, because Mike played a similar role in my life that he did in Danny's life. And I think that, one of the aspects of Waiting for Lightning that's sort of like, under, it's in the film, but it's not as like forward punching first, is just sort of like the the complexity of the, you know healing aspects that skateboarding can have on trauma, and the um, the way that skateboarding is very complicated for people who are a part of it to be able to get out of it, right? Like there's an aspect of Waiting for Lightning that's very dark about, a guy like Danny who has increased the stakes and the scale of what he's doing because he's not satiated anymore, and he sort of destroys himself in the process of doing it to have this really cathartic, complete feeling experience of doing that act of skateboarding. So I, that to me was like incredibly fascinating. And I think there's a lot of skateboarders who skateboard at a scale and at an intensity that tells you a lot about what they have inside of themselves. And then adjacent to that, you have people like myself, who have significant trauma in their childhood, who found this thing and are kind of nourishing themselves in a similar way to the skaters who are actually doing the things. And then if you macro out of that, I think there's this beautiful conversation about the fact that a lot of skateboarding is a lot of, displaced people in pain who are connecting, in this middle layer that serves them both. And so I like having a platform to talk to people intelligently about these things, because this conversation around mental health is very relevant, because now more than ever, it's more validated, it's more discussed, it's more in the zeitgeist. And I think the better we understand our own stories and those underpinning narrative, and emotional components, the easier it is to connect with people, right? Because we know that connecting and talking about it is a means of processing it and a means of working through it. So what Waiting for Lightning opened up for me was a little bit of that beginning dialogue about trauma and skateboarding, and looking at it in one way through a very, big grand scale character, but then the underpinnings of me, of Mike, um, you know allowed access to that I was like, I'd like to keep talking about that.
I want to get into that in 1 minute, but I did have
Yeah.
one specific Waiting for Lightning question. I walked
Mm,
out of the theater with it at the
great.
premiere, and didn't get to it on Weekend Buzz. It wasn't the right
Yeah.
place, but um, I spoke to you earlier about the current project I'm working on, and
Hmm.
there's some really tough questions
Yeah.
I had to ask. Um, Not because I knew they would get answered or even maybe make the film,
Yeah.
but because I needed to just do it to like out of responsibility, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, wh- you guys left the Swindell incident out of the
Hmm.
documentary.
Hmm.
Um, was that a was that like a conscious choice? Was that something that was on the table, and then you guys had to
Absolutely.
decide
Absolutely.
this?
Absolutely. It
Like,
was
talk about that a little bit.
sure, it was an absolute conscious choice.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think a lot of it had to do, not a lot of it, I think all of it has to do with honoring the gravity and the intensity of that situation and of that victim. And Josh was incarcerated at the time. I was speaking to him through a burner phone. I was
Mm-hmm.
writing letters to
Oh
him.
wow.
I actually have a very strong relationship with Josh. a very good relationship with him. I'm incredibly proud of the maturity that he has, the work that he's done on himself, both in prison and getting out of prison. And at that time, there was no way to do an interview with Josh and get into that story without it becoming the story. And
Yeah.
there's an aspect, not an aspect, that story is more Josh's story than Danny's story. So when you're telling the story of a life and you have this incident that is misperceived by a vast majority of people because they don't have all the information, they haven't read the court transcripts, they haven't
Mhm.
spoken to the people who were incarcerated and understand the charges and how the process happened and the fact that people are questioned and all of those things. And when you arrive at that conclusion of what information you have to share and how that could be wedged within the story, and knowing that it shouldn't be wedged out of honoring someone who was killed in an incredibly tragic and disgusting manner, um, it doesn't have a place in that story. And we knew that by not putting it in, people would say, "Oh, they didn't talk about this." But that is what it is. That's part of what Danny himself has to discuss at some point if he feels like wanting to discuss it. Josh has discussed it very
Mhm.
openly.
Yeah.
And I've had a ton of conversations with Josh about it. But if I can't sit Josh in a chair and ask him the questions and have him say it out loud, then I'm projecting something into Danny's story that's not from the authors of the people who were inherently involved. And so my hope is that in time, as Josh tells more about his story, and if Danny decides to tell about his story, then you know that situation could be understood better.
Yeah.
Um, but for me, I have my feelings about everything that I read and everything that I discovered. Carol, my editor, and I, and Brett, my writer, and I, we all went through it, and we all are like, that's a stain on Danny's legacy simply because it hasn't been discussed. It's only been discussed by the
Yeah.
fringe and the triggered, and the rightfully so triggered because of all these motifs and language surrounding that stuff, but also because if you never talk about something, then people just kind of spin the narrative that they
Well, yeah, they
want.
assume the worst too. Like they
Yeah.
assume it's being swept under the rug.
And so I feel that story is Josh's story to tell.
Hmm.
And in the movie of what Danny's relationship to skateboarding and that cycle that I talked about earlier, that darkness of that cycle, but that also has the enlightenment, there's an Icarus,
Hmm.
aspect to that. Um, and also, the what's the Oppenheimer, the um, Prometheus, right?
Oh yeah.
It's a similar thing, right? So I hope that is clarified at some point, but not to satisfy the fringe people who are like, I want that nasty info. It's like, I hope that more of that story is told because I think it sheds light on what I was talking about earlier, which is the trauma and some of the elements that are innately
Mhm.
inside a lot of people in skateboarding. And it's not my place to talk about their stuff,
Yeah.
but I'm always happy to talk about my stuff.